So this is the second video, and this is about the concept in peace and conflict studies of violence, what we mean by violence, how violence is conceptualized, and its implications for peace. Now, violence, of course, has a familiar everyday connotation, everything from fistfights to brawls to stabbing, shooting, bombing, etc. These are all acts of violence. They are violent responses to conflict. But if we're defining peace by the absence of violence, then in the words of Johann Galtung, one of the chief ideas givers, of course, of peace and conflict studies, then too little is excluded by a definition of peace. In other words, a society which has no obvious visible manifestations of that kind of violence, but is nonetheless marked by things like the ills in Syria, which preceded the outbreak of war there, such as extremely high unemployment, inequality, repression, and so forth, there would be a risk that peace would appear to, as it were, anoint a social order in which those ills were rampant as being peaceful. So it would be, in a sense, counterproductive to overall human well-being. So no, peace has to be more demanding than that, and if peace is going to be the absence of violence, then peace has to require far more provision for human fulfillment than merely the absence of direct violence. And that really is the key, because what Galtung did then, therefore, is to define violence not by the form it takes, but by the effect it brings about. And so therefore there's an allowance in that, which is that violence can take many forms, and these forms can all bring about the same effect and should all be recognized, therefore, as violence. But the absence of violence would indeed give rise to a persuasive and inspiring vision of a good society. So let's have a look at a few of the PowerPoints where we summarize some of these insights from Galtung. And we started in the last video with the ABC conflict triangle. There are a few more triangles to come, let me warn you. But first, let's look at how Galtung indeed does define violence. So these are Galtung's two well-known definitions of violence. We'll get the camera in the right place. One is an insult to human needs, and we'll come back to human needs in a few minutes. The other one is that violence is taking place when human beings are being influenced so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential. By somatic, he means bodily. One helpful example, perhaps, of where people's somatic realizations are held below their potential would be that I can go, after recording this video, fill myself a glass of water from the tap and drink it in safety, whereas that is a privilege which, of course, is denied to many of our fellow human beings in the world. So arrangements are in place for me to enjoy that benefit, but they're not in place for others to enjoy that benefit, and that arguably, therefore, holds their somatic realizations below potential. So whatever those arrangements are could be seen as violent. They could be seen as violent. So while it's obvious how my somatic realizations are held below potential if somebody is stabbing me or hitting me or threatening me with a gun, it might be also that my somatic realizations are held below potential by a whole range of other forms. Mental realizations, I hope you feel that you are taking part in a mental realization right now. And of course, as we also know, there are many people in the world who are denied access to education for various reasons, including war, actually. There's increasing concern, as many will have heard, I think, about the extent to which children displaced as a result of war, when their families have to leave their homes, then miss out on large chunks of their schooling. So again, arrangements are in place such that their mental realizations are held below their potential. So there's the violence of war, which caused their family to flee in the first place, and then there's the violence built in to those arrangements which don't allow them to fulfill their potential. So that's the argument about violence, that violence essentially is an abrogation of human potential, and the cause of that abrogation of potential can take many forms. And those forms are categorized by Galtung into three headings, three segments, namely direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. So here's another triangle coming up now. There we are. There's the violence triangle. And the direct violence at the top is visible, and it's called direct because it's characterized by a direct subject-action-object relationship. A did or threatened to do B to C. So that's visible violence or direct violence, sometimes called physical violence. And relative to our former triangle, of course, that is most closely analogous to behavior in the ABC conflict triangle. So that's direct violence, but then the same effect can be brought about by invisible forms of violence, one of which is structural violence. And structural violence are social practices and forms of social organizations which freeze contradictions. They freeze contradictions. So, for example, one of the best known examples, perhaps, the apartheid regime in South Africa, with its restricted occupations, segregated residential areas, whites-only buses and so forth. That was a system in which the racial conflict was made real in everyday life. And it was a system in which everyone took part. And that's the other difference between them. It's very easy to point at the perpetrator of an act of direct violence, but it's much more difficult to figure out who is actually responsible, whose fault it is, when these arrangements are in place which place a block on the fulfillment of human potential. Structural violence is something that we inhabit, and it's often very difficult to step outside it. In the other point of the triangle, cultural violence, analogous to the attitudes in the ABC conflict triangle, we can reach for different forms of imagery, wording, different stores of meaning, perhaps in cultural production, when we form attitudes about other parties to the conflict. And Galtung's definition of cultural violence is cultural forms which have the effect of making other forms of violence look, even feel right, or at least not wrong. I've sometimes pondered on the apparent enduring enthusiasm of the United Kingdom government to involve itself in armed conflict. It seems terribly keen on that, in spite of lots of evidence that it doesn't actually meet its stated objectives. And I've often wondered whether that is somehow connected with the rather extraordinary fact, when you start looking at it, of the statuary in central London. You take a walk round the environs of Westminster, Whitehall, Trafalgar Square, all the kind of London tourist traps, you will see statue after statue. There must be, tons and tons of bronze in the area, and almost all of them are statues of war heroes, statues of military men. So there's a very strong kind of store of what could be seen as cultural violence there, and that may be a store of meanings which the British government reaches for when it comes to responding to conflict. So they could be seen as a form of cultural violence. So those are the three categories that Galtung proposes for violence, and some is direct and visible, but much of the other violence is indirect and invisible. And one could ponder, well, which is the more destructive, which is the bigger problem, the visible or the invisible? Certainly, the damage and destruction and the death and mayhem caused by war, that is by direct violence, is extremely problematical and very much a feature of today's world that it's very important to try to figure out how to stop. But equally, the death toll from those forms, generally speaking, is put rather in the shade by comparison with the number of our fellow humans who are still perishing and still falling ill as the result of deprivation. That is to say, a want of access to basic things that we here in Australia might take for granted, such as access to clean drinking water, to adequate food, and to basic medicine. And we could so arrange things as to ensure that everyone had access to those essentials, but for some reason we have caused different arrangements to prevail. And those arrangements could be seen as structurally violent, therefore, and they may be thought of as still more destructive than the direct violence which we see in wars around the world. So it's equally important to attend to the structural violence as to the direct violence.